That was amazing. Thank you. First, we could maybe give people a little bit more background in terms of the McChrystal Group, in terms of what you're doing today, who you're working with, and what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I left the service, and I left with the belief or the suspicion that what we had gone through had nothing to do with war, had nothing to do with a unique military situation. In reality, what we had gone through was a universal reality that we're in a different environment now. And so the company's based on that thesis. So we started working with commercial firms to see whether or not that's in fact the case, whether they had the same problems we have. And the reality is, it's almost exactly the same. There's this belief in a lot of people who have never been in the civilian world like military or never been in the military civilians that there's this great divide and this difference. And you know, it was funny, in my whole career, if ever you got a bunch of military guys together, at some point in the meeting, somebody would pound the table and say, damn it, if we were a civilian company, we'd go bankrupt. They'd never be this stupid. Every time. And when I got out and I get in civilian meetings, every time somebody pounds the table and said, Stan, the military would never be this stupid, would we? And I go, no. I mean, it's exactly the same because it's people. And so the same problems, but the same path to solutions.
Talk about, so we talked about Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we talked about the 1-0 being Al-Qaeda, and then the next we got Al-Qaeda Iraq. Talk about that, and then now what we're seeing with ISIS.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? What's
the difference between Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was the use of information technology. And what that did was that enabled them to not be tethered by many of the old processes, mental processes, but also physical things as well. And so they became very fast, very adaptable. And it also became much more democratic because people were off on their own, just connected by virtual connections. And so they had a lot more autonomy because there's nobody really physically to do them. And it actually made them stronger, not less strong. ISIS is 3.0 from the standpoint, it still uses information technology, but it uses it in a very different way. It considers what Al-Qaeda in Iraq did to have been very basic. What ISIS does is it leverages influencing technology in a way that Al-Qaeda in Iraq never could. ISIS has got 55 of these propaganda headquarters, nodes, that are both empowered to act autonomously, decentralized, but they're also connected by common intent, and so they constantly stay connected. They communicate with about 100 million people a day. They take a doctrine which to most people in the region is absolutely an anathema to anything that they want, but they sell it pretty well. They make it seem like it's a going concern, that this is an effective organization. And they've got some effectiveness, but in the case of many organizations, you've got a big organization and a small ability to communicate. What they are is they are a huge ability to communicate and a very limited ability to operate. But what it does is it allows them to do a franchise model where there are people around the world, in Europe, United States, Africa, that get up in the morning and think that they are ISIS. They've never met anybody, al-Baghdadi, from ISIS headquarters. They have no functional connection, and there's no money passing, there's no training. There's nothing of what we think is traditional command and control. There's just this identification. But it's pretty powerful.
It's scary. When you look at, you made a comment that made me think about, and I'm not going to get his name right, the Jordanian who became a head of
Zarqawi.
And you talk about sort of the kind of hoodlum background, and then his mom sends him off to religious school. I mean, when you look at the issue of education,
yeah.
It seems that one of the greatest issues is basically these people, a lot of these people just don't feel like they have a future, and the education that they do have, is basically poison their brains. I mean, how big an issue is that, and what can be done in your view?
Well, there are two parts of that, and you're right on both of them. The first is the common denominator word in the Middle East among young men and young women increasingly is humiliation. And what they really mean by that is this combination of frustration that they think that their leaders, the autocratic leaders which have been running their countries, have been co-opted by the West, and then they think the West is guilty of denying them political, economic, and social freedom, and or opportunity. And to a great degree, they are right. And so even in those countries where there is a fair amount of wealth and stability, there's not a lot of political or social freedom. And so what you've got, or opportunity, what you've got is a very constrained populace, many of whom feel like that they are being held back by people who mean them no good. Now, in some cases, it's blame shifting. They are partially responsible for the way things are. So, you know, I don't agree with all of it, but I do appreciate the power that it has. So that's sort of the fundamental thing. And when we looked at the Arab Spring in December 2010, everybody said, look, all the young people, they want democracy. They're in Tahrir Square. They were not out there for democracy. Some were. They were out there as a rejection of the status quo. But different groups all had different ideas of what the future ought to be. And what you find in that kind of chaotic situation is the more extreme groups tend to be better organized and get more traction than less organized and extreme groups. And so that is what happened. On the education side, I tried to open madrasas in Afghanistan. I tried to get U.S. government money to open madrasas. And that was not a real popular idea because we're dealing with Islamic extremism, and here I'm saying let's open religious schools. Well, the problem is Saudi money, but Gulf money and others was going into Pakistan. It was opening very extreme madrasas. And young men would go over there to study. And one of the things that they would do is memorize the Quran. Well, the Quran is written in Arabic, and the young men did not speak Arabic. So what they did is they memorized the Quran, and then they had certain people telling them what it meant. So they didn't have the ability to do critical thinking for themselves. And so, they are told time and again, this is what it means, and this is what your responsibility is. And the Quran is actually a much more nuanced document than that. But so you're producing this group of people who didn't really get an education. What they got was a very narrow indoctrination. And so I think that the solution to that isn't, you're not going to do away with Islam, and I wouldn't suggest that. What I'm saying is, if you give somebody a full Islamic education, a much broader Islamic education, then they have ability to do the kind of rational reasoning for themselves, and that's a much healthier place for us to be in.
Let me ask you a tough question. So you're a student of history. We have the greatest military intelligence anywhere. We knew it happened in Afghanistan, the history of Afghanistan before. Why did we go in? And what did we learn? What was the what was the mistake, and what did we learn from that?
Yeah, if you look at a lot of big mistakes, there's very rarely a time when people come in the room and they got all the information and they go, okay, should we go fight a decade-long war in Vietnam? It's going to cost us 58,000 American lives, and it's not going to come out well. What do you think? And it's not a bunch of idiots who say, yeah, let's do that. Sort of the same in Afghanistan. Decisions get made incrementally. And sometimes those decisions are not completely informed and the people in the room haven't done enough of their homework. And sometimes we are unwilling to look at the sweep of history. But other times, good people who know a lot really want something to come out a certain way. I mean, think of people who've got a child who's got real problems. Think how much you want to believe that the child is going to stop using drugs. That time they tell you, I'm not going to use them anymore, I'm not going to do this. You want to believe so badly because that's the outcome in which you're invested. That's, you believe in the universal goodness of people. And you can find yourself, even at a national level, on very important things like this, trying, because you want something to happen, your reasoning is influenced by that. This is so interesting. Everybody talks, I wasn't in the room when they decided to invade Iraq or any of these, but I was senior enough to have been around. And I would tell you, in my whole time in those circles, I never once ran into anybody who I considered evil or trying to screw it up. I ran into good people trying hard. I might disagree with them, and I did disagree with them, on many things, But good people with good intentions does not guarantee a good outcome. And so I think that's when you have to look at processes and all the kinds of things you can do to shed light on your decision making, so that you get that critical thinking that says, now wait a minute, I know you want Afghanistan to turn out this way. I know you want the people to do this, but is that a rational assumption to make, that's a high probability? And in many cases, it's not, whether we want it to be or not.
So now you're a professor at Yale, in addition to being the head of the McChrystal Group. And one thing you told me, which I got to experience the same thing, is you take your students to Gettysburg and do what's called a staff ride. Talk about that and why you find that to be so valuable.
So I teach this graduate, it's 14 graduate students and 6 undergraduates, and it's a semester-long seminar. And it's a pretty special group of people each time. I've never had a bad student in there in 6 years. But it's not a military course, it's a leadership course. So we study business, all the different things. But we go to Gettysburg, and of the 20 students, typically 1 will have been there before. Typically, and if I have a veteran in the class, they may know what happened there, but there's almost no understanding of what happened in our Civil War. Now, it's not a history course, so I don't drill on that, but what we do is we role play. We divide the class into 3 groups, and those as groups have to look at key decisions on the battle and what I want them to do is come in and be able to explain the people that were in the decision. Tell me their history, tell me their families, tell me what their life was like, tell me how they would be impacted by decisions that they made. And then we go to those spots and we stand on the battlefield, and those little groups give that, and the other groups ask questions. And being on the ground makes it so much more understandable to them. Suddenly you realize that 50-some thousand people were killed or wounded on here in 3 days, and there's this sense of the importance of leadership and some of these relationships that were so critical. And yet again, this is generally all good people on both sides, trying to do what they thought was right. And so appreciating that has turned out to be really powerful.
I could ask you questions all night, but I've only got time for one more, and you've been so gracious with your time. Thank you. You feel very strongly about the importance of national service. Tell us why you think that's so important, what you're doing, and how people here could help.
Well, Michael, thanks for asking. When I think of citizenship in America, I think of what citizenship is. I think it's a covenant between people. We tend to think of citizenship as a right. I was born here, or I got naturalized here, and so I've got this thing. I'm a citizen. It's my set of rights. But really, citizenship in a nation is just an agreement between a bunch of people to form a nation and to have relationships between the people, which gives you rights and responsibilities. And so you've got this covenant. And so citizenship means I signed on to the covenant. There are things I'm willing to do to be a citizen, and the things that I get from that. And it's mutual defense, and it's a number of things. But I think that our idea of citizenship is shrunken. I tend to think that a lot of people say, well, I'm a citizen. If I pay my taxes and if I vote, I'm doing my job. But I think it's much more than that. And traditionally in our society, it was a lot more than that. And you think of education, responsibility for schools, responsibility for kids, the idea that communities raise children. We had a society for many years that just practically had to have more sinew, but now we're so mobile and we tend to be more insular. You can live in a neighborhood and not know your neighbors. And so I think we've got to expand the idea of citizenship again. Now, so where do you get it? And, I joined the Army not to serve my nation. I mean, my father and grandfather served, all my brothers served, but I served because I joined because I thought it would be interesting. I thought it would be an adventure. But after a few years, you serve for other reasons. It's just like I think why you go into education or another cause. You do it initially for whatever reason, and then over time, it grows inside you, this sense of responsibility, this sense of debt to others. And I think that's the way citizenship is. And so, but where do you get it? I don't think you can teach it in a civics class. I just don't think it's real enough. And so I am a believer that every young American should get an opportunity to serve a year of service, full-time paid service, healthcare, conservation, whatever they like. And I think it'll bring people together that wouldn't meet, people from zip codes that wouldn't deal. It will also invest all of them. You know, it'll be hard, but at the end of that year, they'll think, you know, I feel different about this because I've contributed more to it. And I think that it will grow our sense of citizenship, which I think will then show itself up in our politics and everything we do later in the country. And so I think it's the single biggest, I'm not going to call it a gift to the young of America. I'm going to call it our responsibility to give them that opportunity. And so that's the big thing that I'm passionate about.
That's awesome. So we're all done.
Michael, my honor. Thanks so much.
Awesome.
Perfect.